They claimed my actions burned through $2 million an hour. They labeled it corporate sabotage. But I just call it doing my job. When a Wall Street suit tries saving a few pennies by risking thousands of lives, you do not just walk away, you lock the doors, freeze the inventory, and watch his career shatter like a nitrogen-soaked glass. It was never about the money. It was about the cold truth. Hello, listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero operating budget to keep these stories coming. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our dedicated team can pay their living expenses and continue creating content for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Piper Evans. I am 34 years old, and until recently, I was the Chief Thermodynamic Systems Engineer at Meridian Biologistics in Denver. Meridian was not merely a warehouse. It was one of the premier cold chain supply hubs for biosensitive pharmaceuticals in the entire United States. My domain was the Central Control Room, a space I often referred to as the sleepless heart of the medical system. It was a freezing, windowless bunker buried deep within the reinforced concrete bowels of the facility. The air inside always carried a sharp, sterile bite that stung the back of your throat. And the only soundtrack to my 12-hour shifts was the deep, rhythmic groaning of the liquid nitrogen pumps pushing coolant through miles of insulated piping. The perpetual gloom of the room was constantly pierced by the glaring, clinical white light radiating from dozens of massive temperature monitoring screens. To most people, the isolation and the constant mechanical noise would feel like a sensory prison. But to me, it was a sanctuary of absolute precision. In my world, every fluctuation, every microscopic drop in pressure or slight spike in ambient heat meant the difference between a life-saving cure and a vial of useless, highly toxic liquid. That uncompromising precision was about to be put to the ultimate test. We were scheduled to receive a massive incoming shipment of next-generation immunosuppressants. These drugs represented a monumental leap forward for transplant patients across the country, but their biological makeup was incredibly fragile. The entire batch was valued at tens of millions of dollars, and their chemical stability was dictated by a brutally strict thermal tolerance limit. The storage temperature could not vary by more than 0.5 degrees Celsius, anything outside that razor-thin margin, and the complex molecular structure would irrevocably break down, rendering the medication useless and potentially lethal. And then there was Julian Croft. Julian was our newly appointed Vice President of Operations, freshly transferred from the high-stakes, ruthless trading floors of Wall Street. He was the kind of man who wore overly tight, obscenely expensive Italian suits to an industrial refrigeration plant. He drenched himself in a suffocating, musky cologne that lingered in the pristine hallways long after he had walked away. Julian did not understand thermodynamics. He did not possess the slightest grasp of microbiology or patient safety. To him, this highly sensitive facility was just another spreadsheet, and every rigorous safety standard I fought to maintain was nothing more than an unacceptable waste of cash flow. He was aggressively determined to make his mark on the corporate ladder, and his strategy was violently simple/operational costs to the bone in order to make his first quarterly financial report look like a masterpiece, utterly blind to the real-world consequences. His aggressive ignorance finally materialized in my inbox on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. The email was heavily dressed in corporate jargon, mentioning words like synergy and optimization. But the underlying demand was crystal clear. Julian ordered me to rewrite the core thermodynamic software. He specifically commanded me to force the primary cooling matrix into a mandatory hibernation mode for 2 hours every single night. The sole objective was to cut our massive energy consumption during off-peak hours to save money. I sat rigidly in my chair, staring at the glowing monitor, reading his arrogant words over and over to make sure I was not hallucinating. Shutting down the active cooling for 2 hours would inevitably cause ambient heat to seep into the heavy storage vaults. The temperature variance would blow right past the 0.5 degrees Celsius limit within 45 minutes. It would completely obliterate the chemical integrity of the new immunosuppressants. He was effectively ordering me to ruin tens of millions of dollars worth of vital medication just to save a negligible fraction of that amount on the monthly electric bill. I did not hesitate for a single second. I hit reply and typed out a blunt, unyielding response. I absolutely refuse to execute this directive. Halting the cooling matrix will violate the strict thermal parameters of the incoming shipment and cause catastrophic chemical degradation. The safety risk is entirely unacceptable. I hit send, fully aware that a man like Julian would not take no for an answer. He viewed technical warnings as blatant insubordination. So, while I waited for the inevitable corporate retaliation, I went straight to work. I pulled a high-capacity encrypted flash drive from my tactical backpack and quietly began siphoning the unvarnished truth. I downloaded every single log of our required temperature baselines, the manufacturer's specifications for the new drugs, and most importantly, a pristine, time-stamped copy of Julian's damning email. As the progress bar silently filled across my screen, I opened a secure, untraceable browser window. My fingers moved across the keyboard with cold, calculated intent as I began drafting a comprehensive, undeniable violation report to submit directly to the Food and Drug Administration. The heavy, reinforced blast doors of the control room hissed open at exactly 5 in the morning. I had been staring at the telemetry readouts for 10 relentless hours, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors. The sudden intrusion shattered the rhythmic isolation of the bunker. Julian strode in, the sharp clacking of his polished Italian leather shoes echoing unnaturally against the grated steel floor. He was not alone. Trailing closely behind him was the Director of Human Resources, clutching a digital tablet to her chest like a shield, flanked by 2 towering security contractors whose thick arms crossed tightly over their black tactical vests. Julian wore a sickeningly smug smile, the predatory grin of a man who firmly believed he held absolutely all the cards. He did not bother with pleasantries. He stopped a few feet from my console, the aggressive scent of his expensive cologne immediately polluting the sterile, nitrogen-tinged air of my sanctuary. "Piper," he began, his voice dripping with thick condescension, "I am going to make this incredibly simple for you. You have 2 choices. You will turn around, type whatever command is necessary to initiate the nightly power down sequence, and implement the energy-saving code right now. Or, you will be terminated on the spot for directly opposing the strategic development direction of this company. Choose." The HR director shifted uncomfortably, deliberately avoiding my gaze, but the security guards took a synchronized step forward, looming large in the cramped, freezing space. The atmosphere grew instantly thick, suffocating, and incredibly tense. I slowly swiveled my chair to face him, keeping my hands resting casually on my lap. I absolutely refused to let him see even a fraction of intimidation. "If I kill the power to the primary matrix, even for a short window, we lose the steady state," I stated, keeping my tone deadly flat and strictly professional. "You are not just turning off a light switch in a vacant hallway, Julian. You are stopping the active, life-saving circulation. Without continuous kinetic flow, the liquefied gas pressure inside the main manifolds will violently destabilize. We will experience rapid phase transition. The coolant will boil off into gas, creating a massive localized pressure spike that will force the thermal relief valves to vent into the atmosphere. Once that happens, the ambient temperature in the primary storage vaults will skyrocket. That shipment will denature and turn into a highly toxic, totally useless sludge before the morning shift even clocks in to check the logs." Julian rolled his eyes, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that bounced off the metal walls. "Gah, you engineers are all exactly the same," he sneered, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Always hiding behind your little apocalyptic science fiction scenarios. You just want to sound indispensable. You want to make this basic warehouse sound like a nuclear reactor so you can justify your inflated salary. I am not interested in your dramatic over-exaggerations. The risk is absolutely zero, and the financial savings are massive. Now, touch the keyboard, and do your job. No. The single word hung in the freezing air, sharp as a surgical scalpel. I did not move a single muscle. I stared directly into his eyes. I will not intentionally destroy this inventory. Julian's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, flushed mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck visibly bulged against his tight collar. "Fine, you are done," he spat out, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are fired, effective immediately. Cut her off." He snapped his fingers violently at the HR director. She rapidly tapped the screen of her tablet, her fingers shaking slightly. A harsh, electronic chime echoed from the overhead security speakers. At the exact same second, all 4 of my primary workstation monitors flashed crimson red, then instantly locked to a dead black screen displaying the words "Access Denied" in stark white letters, my security clearance, my administrative system privileges, and my entire digital identity within Meridian Biologistics were completely annihilated in a fraction of a heartbeat. I was officially a ghost in my own machine. "Escort her off the property," Julian barked at the 2 armed guards. "Do not let her touch another piece of equipment." Instead of panicking, instead of begging for my job or screaming in bitter frustration, I simply smirked. It was a cold, genuine smile. I stood up gracefully, unzipped my worn tactical backpack, and methodically began packing my personal thermos, my engineering notebook, and my favorite pen. As I zipped the bag shut, I cast one final, fleeting glance toward the secondary alarm terminal mounted high on the far wall. It was an isolated system, not connected to my user profile. Deep in the bottom right corner of that screen, a tiny glowing hourglass icon had just materialized, silently blinking its inevitable countdown. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and walked right past Julian, stopping just inches from his flushed, angry face. "You just pulled the ventilator plug on this entire plant." "Julian," I whispered, making absolutely sure the words chilled him to the bone. "Good luck with your strategic direction." I was sandwiched tightly between the 2 heavily built contractors, marching down the grand, transparent glass corridor that bridged the executive wing to the main logistics floor. It was exactly 6 in the morning, the absolute peak of the facility shift change. The sprawling hallway was packed with bodies. Hundreds of eyes belonging to logistics coordinators, lab technicians, and junior structural engineers suddenly snapped toward me. The low hum of morning chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the synchronized, heavy thud of our boots against the polished floor. I looked out through the glass at the pristine facility around me, feeling a sharp, quiet pang of melancholy beneath my calm exterior. I had spent 5 years meticulously calibrating the mechanical veins and arteries of this place, building it into an impenetrable fortress of biopreservation. I knew every valve, every sensor, every hidden quirk of the cooling matrices. Now, I was being paraded through my own life's work like a captured enemy of the state. Julian trailed just a few feet behind my right shoulder, making absolutely sure his voice boomed loud enough for the entire gallery to hear. He was reveling in the spectacle, clearly treating my termination as a theatrical performance meant to cement his dominance. "Take a good, hard look, everyone," he announced, his tone swelling with a sickening, synthetic authority. "Meridian Biologistics is evolving. We are streamlining our operations for the modern, highly competitive market. That means we are actively purging individuals who refuse to adapt to our new corporate vision. Nobody is immune to progress." He was using me as a human billboard, a brutal, public warning to anyone who might even think about questioning his upcoming budget cuts or dangerous shortcuts. I kept my chin raised, letting his hollow words wash right over me, my mind already running the calculations of the disaster he was blindly walking into. Near the end of the walkway, I locked eyes with Elias. He was a bright, 23-year-old junior technician whom I had personally mentored since his first day. His face was entirely drained of color, his jaw hanging slightly slack, as the terrifying reality of my armed escort hit him. He knew exactly what my sudden departure meant for the facility's incredibly fragile ecosystem. He took a hesitant, panicked step forward, his hands trembling at his sides, wanting to intervene. I immediately softened my rigid expression and offered him a steady, reassuring look. I gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent message passing between us. I knew he lacked the administrative clearance to halt the impending avalanche, and I absolutely did not want him caught in the destructive crossfire of Julian's ego. We finally reached the front reception desk, a sleek curved marble slab guarding the main exit doors. The human resources director caught up, slightly out of breath from the brisk walk, and aggressively demanded I surrender all company-issued electronics. I did not argue. I did not put up a fight. I reached slowly into my bag and pulled out my heavy-duty administrative tablet. I wiped my thumb across the biometric scanner one last time, feeling the familiar, brief vibration of the fingerprint read, recognizing my identity, and placed it gently onto the cold marble surface. The screen glowed green for a fraction of a second, before the network recognized the physical surrender and faded to a dead gray. They thought they were stripping away my power. They had absolutely no idea that physically severing my continuous biometric heartbeat from the internal server network was the precise, non-negotiable condition required to arm the final failsafe. The trap was now set. The heavy glass automated doors slid open, pushing me out into the biting morning chill. The Denver sky above was a bruised, heavy slate gray, promising a bitter, unforgiving frost. I walked across the sprawling asphalt parking lot until I reached my faded, 10-year-old Subaru. I unlocked the door, slid into the worn driver's seat, and shut the heavy door, sealing out the world. But I did not turn the ignition key to start the engine. Instead, I clicked the battery power on, cranked up the cabin heater to full blast, and unscrewed the lid of my personal thermos. The rich, dark scent of black coffee filled the small, cold space. I poured a steaming cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and pressed the top button on my digital wristwatch to start the timer. I sat quietly in the driver's seat of my battered Subaru, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the digital numbers on my dashboard clock tick away. 14 minutes. 14 minutes and 30 seconds. Exactly 15 minutes after my biometric signature was forcibly severed from the main server, the trap violently snapped shut. I had named it the Thermal Quarantine Protocol. It was a deeply buried, completely silent piece of defensive architecture I had written into the very foundation of the facility network 2 years ago. I originally designed it to protect the inventory against sophisticated cyber attacks or a hostile digital takeover. The logic was brilliantly simple. If the system detected that a verified senior thermodynamic administrator was suddenly absent without formally transferring command protocols, it assumed the network was severely compromised. It instantly removed the human element entirely. Deep inside the bowels of the Meridian facility, the silent shift was instantaneous and absolute. The massive, insulated steel doors of the primary cold storage vault's doors that normally glided open on smooth magnetic tracks suddenly slammed shut with terrifying, bone-rattling force. Heavy, tungsten-reinforced mechanical deadbolts violently shot into their strike plates with loud, echoing clanks that reverberated through the concrete floors. It was a sound the facility workers had never heard before. The digital keypads mounted next to every entrance instantly went black, severing all local access. Simultaneously, the main cooling matrix completely overrode Julian's absurd energy-saving directives. The system seamlessly shifted into what the code called survival mode. Huge, heavy-duty valves groaned as they opened to maximum capacity, violently flushing the holding chambers with dense liquid nitrogen to freeze every single pallet of sensitive cargo at a perfectly stabilized, completely impenetrable temperature. The inventory was now 100% protected from the outside world, but it was also entirely inaccessible. The system would violently reject any inbound or outbound logistical commands. The drugs were perfectly safe, and nobody was getting to them. Outside in the gray morning light, The logistical nightmare began to materialize almost immediately. The massive loading bays, designed to handle a flawlessly timed choreography of inbound and outbound freight, quickly transformed into a chaotic bottleneck. A fleet of massive, specialized refrigerated 18-wheelers began lining up at the security gates. When the bay doors completely failed to open and the loading supervisors could not pull up a single digital manifest, the entire operation ground to a painful, grinding halt. Impatient truck drivers, running on extremely tight federal driving schedules, began laying heavily on their air horns. The deafening, overlapping blasts echoed across the industrial park, a massive symphony of pure mechanical frustration. Inside the glass-walled logistics offices overlooking the bays, every single landline phone began ringing at the exact same time. Major medical distribution hubs and regional hospitals were calling frantically, demanding to know why their critically urgent morning deliveries of biologicals and transplant medications were suddenly delayed. It was a spectacular, rapidly expanding disaster of epic proportions. My personal cell phone began violently vibrating against the plastic center console of my car. The screen lit up with a rapid, endless barrage of frantic text messages from Elias. I picked it up and read the panicked updates scrolling across the glass. "Piper, what is happening? The vaults are entirely sealed off." Julian is completely losing his mind. He is currently standing in the main server room, screaming at the IT technicians. The central system is flat out denying all administrative override passwords. He realizes he is locked out. He looks like he's going to have a heart attack. I smiled softly to myself, placing the phone back down. It took exactly 6 more minutes for Julian to finally understand the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. When my phone screen lit up again, it was an incoming call from his direct office line. I let it ring 4 times before calmly tapping the green answer button. I did not say a word. I just listened to the heavy, panicked breathing on the other end. "You psychotic maniac!" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw terror and unhinged fury. "Turn it back on. Turn the system back on right this second, or I swear to God I will personally drag you into a federal court. I will have you arrested for corporate sabotage and the deliberate destruction of company infrastructure. You are going to federal prison. Piper?" I took another slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat before I finally responded. "You cannot sue a piece of software for doing exactly what the federal government mandated it to do." "Julian," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. "You are experiencing an automated, perfectly legal lockdown. I suggest you carefully review Section 4, Paragraph B of the strict biological safety compliance contract your CEO signed with the federal government last year. The system merely detected an unauthorized, highly dangerous attempt to compromise the thermal stability of a Class 1 biological hazard. Since you aggressively fired the only qualified engineer authorized to maintain the steady state, the system went into an autonomous quarantine to prevent you from poisoning thousands of patients." "Listen to me. You insane—" "I am no longer an employee of Meridian Biologistics," I interrupted sharply. "Have a wonderful morning, Julian." I ended the call, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and finally turned the ignition key. The Subaru engine sputtered to life. I drove out of the parking lot, the cacophony of blaring truck horns fading slowly behind me, and pulled into the gravel lot of a quiet, neon-lit roadside diner about 3 miles down the highway. I walked into the diner, slid into an empty vinyl booth in the far back corner, and ordered a plate of eggs and a fresh pot of coffee. I pulled my personal laptop from my bag, booted it up, and immediately connected to a heavily encrypted, anonymous virtual private network. With a few quick keystrokes, I quietly slipped into the unmonitored back doors of the company's internal communication boards. The digital panic spreading across the internal screens was incredibly beautiful to witness. The accounting department was already flashing severe red warnings across the executive channels, because they were legally bound by heavily penalized, time-sensitive emergency delivery contracts. The inability to move the inventory was triggering massive automated fines. Meridian Biologistics was currently bleeding exactly $2 million every single hour they remained locked out of their own vaults. The dominoes were falling perfectly, and the most satisfying part was that Julian had pushed the first one over entirely by himself. I sat deeply entrenched in the cracked vinyl booth of the diner. My eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my laptop. Through a heavily encrypted, read-only telemetry port, I had buried deep within the network topology. I watched the digital heartbeat of the facility. I had no administrative control anymore, absolutely no way to send commands, but I could observe the raw data streams passively. The financial hemorrhage was catastrophic, crossing the $2 million mark as the first hour rolled by. But Julian was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a creature born of Wall Street arrogance, a man who firmly believed that every single lock in the world had a price tag. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, a tiny, pulsing amber indicator illuminated the top right corner of my interface. My breath hitched slightly. The amber light represented the physical chassis of the central control node. Someone was manually unscrewing the heavy steel access panels. Julian had completely bypassed our highly regulated, federally vetted Internal Information Technology Department. He knew they would demand proper authorization and legal clearances that he simply did not possess. Instead, driven by pure, unadulterated desperation to save his vice presidential title, he had reached into the digital underworld. He had hired a gray hat. I knew the type intimately, an off-the-books, freelance contractor who specialized in brute force hardware bypass techniques, a ghost with a heavy tool bag who asked absolutely zero questions as long as the cash transfer cleared. Julian was terrified, watching his career evaporate by the second, so he made the ultimate, unforgivable miscalculation. He tried to cheat the physics of a biosecure bunker. Through the passive data logs, I could visualize the precise sequence of events unfolding miles away. The hacker would be kneeling in front of the exposed server rack, tracing the intricate web of fiber optic cables and copper wires. Julian would be hovering nervously over his shoulder, sweating profusely through his bespoke Italian fabric, demanding immediate results. The contractor would identify the primary locking circuit and attempt a hardwired jump. He would pull out a pair of heavy wire cutters and slice straight through the main signal line, intending to trick the magnetic doors into a default open state by simulating a simple power loss. It was a classic, arrogant shortcut, and it was the exact fatal trap I had meticulously designed for anyone foolish enough to think they could bypass the software with a pair of pliers. On my screen, the amber light suddenly shifted to a glaring, aggressive crimson red. The physical connection had just been severed. The hacker had cut the wire. Inside the cold, echoing server room of the facility, they were likely waiting for the heavy blast doors to smoothly slide open. They were waiting for a triumphant beep of success. Instead, the total severing of that specific copper line triggered the absolute worst-case scenario embedded in the deepest foundation of the facility architecture. The system did not register a simple glitch or a manual override. It registered a hostile, wide-scale physical sabotage attempt by an unknown entity. The entire infrastructure assumed the building was falling into enemy hands. The digital readouts on my laptop violently shifted from defensive lockdown to full-blown, aggressive retaliation. The screen flashed with a rapid string of command executions. The system had autonomously activated the emergency purge protocol. Back at Meridian, all hell broke loose in a fraction of a second. The massive high-pressure backup suppression pillars mounted along the ceiling of the quarantine zone roared to life with the deafening sound of a jet engine detonating indoors. Designed exclusively to extinguish hypothetical chemical fires without using damaging water, these cannons simultaneously discharged thousands of gallons of hyperdense, supercooled liquid nitrogen fog. A colossal, blindingly white cloud of freezing vapor violently erupted from the ceiling vents, instantly engulfing the massive storage bays in an impenetrable blizzard. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the rapidly expanding gas had to escape the pressurized concrete vault. The overwhelming force pushed the thick, white fog directly up through the heavy industrial exhaust shafts, violently blowing the iron grates off the roof. To the panicked truck drivers standing in the parking lot, and to the morning commuters driving past the industrial park, the visual was apocalyptic. It looked exactly like a catastrophic, highly lethal chemical leak. A massive, terrifying plume of thick white smoke was billowing aggressively into the gray Denver sky, spreading rapidly across the roofline. Simultaneously, the internal atmosphere of the building was shattered by the piercing, ear-splitting shriek of the primary biohazard alarms. Strobe lights began flashing a blinding, frantic yellow across every single floor and hallway. The automated emergency broadcast system immediately hijacked every overhead speaker, announcing a Level 4 containment breach on a continuous, terrifyingly calm mechanical loop. This was no longer a quiet, internal corporate disaster. A Level 4 biohazard alert automatically bypassed all local security desks. The system instantly hardlined an encrypted, unstoppable distress signal directly to the dispatch center of the Denver Fire Department and the Regional Crisis Office of the Department of Homeland Security. There was absolutely no abort sequence. There was no password, no executive override, and no physical button that could stop the transmission. By trying to pick the lock, Julian had officially turned a costly logistical delay into a full-scale federal emergency. I sat back comfortably in the quiet, warm diner, picking up my heavy ceramic mug. The hot coffee sent a soothing, victorious wave through my chest. I turned my head and looked out the large, condensation-streaked glass window facing the main interstate. The distant, low wail of sirens began to bleed through the thick glass, cutting through the background noise of the diner kitchen. Within moments, the sound amplified into a deafening, overlapping roar. A massive, heavy convoy tore past my window. 3 massive hook-and-ladder fire trucks, 2 specialized hazardous materials response units, and at least a half-dozen police cruisers flew down the asphalt. They were all running perfectly synchronized, their sirens screaming, and their emergency lights painting the cloudy morning sky in frantic, aggressive flashes of red and blue. They were accelerating blindly toward Meridian Biologistics, rushing into a war zone created entirely by one man's greed. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. Julian wanted to save a few pennies on the electric bill. Now, he had a heavily armed federal task force kicking down his front door. I switched my laptop screen to the live feed of a local Denver news station. The aerial helicopter shot displayed the Meridian Biologistics campus, now completely transformed into a heavily fortified quarantine zone. A massive perimeter of bright yellow police tape and heavily armored tactical vehicles sealed off the entire property. First responders clad in thick, bright orange hazardous material suits were systematically advancing toward the main loading bays, their heavy breathing apparatuses making them look like astronauts invading an alien planet. An aggressive swarm of local news reporters was already stationed just beyond the barricades, eagerly pointing their heavy broadcast cameras at the chaotic scene and desperately trying to speculate about the massive plume of white vapor still clinging to the roofline. My phone suddenly shattered the quiet ambience of the diner. The caller identification displayed an international number. It was Marcus Vance, the chief executive officer of Meridian. He was supposed to be enjoying a luxurious, month-long vacation in a private villa somewhere in southern Europe. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. "Piper, please tell me you can stop this," Marcus pleaded, his voice entirely stripped of its usual polished corporate authority. He sounded utterly breathless, practically begging through the transatlantic static. "I just received the emergency alert from Homeland Security. The local authorities are threatening to seize the entire facility. I know Julian fired you. He is an absolute idiot, and he is officially terminated as of this exact second. If you get in your car right now, drive back there, and unlock those vaults. I will immediately pay you 3 times your original salary. I will give you full operational control. Just please, fix this before the government shuts us down permanently." I listened to a desperate billionaire grovel, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy sense of finality. "I cannot do that, Marcus," I replied calmly. my tone as rigid and unyielding as the concrete walls of the bunker I had built. The system is currently functioning exactly as it was designed to. Julian brought an unauthorized, off-the-books contractor into a secure server room to physically slice through the main hardware lines. He bypassed federal safety regulations to try and force the vaults open, with a fully mobilized hazardous materials team currently storming your lobby. If I were to suddenly log in and attempt to mask that massive security breach, I would instantly become an accessory to a major federal crime. I will not go to a federal penitentiary for your company. While I spoke to him, I used my free hand to navigate the secure portal of the Food and Drug Administration on my laptop. I had already attached the massive, encrypted file containing hundreds of pages of classified internal documents, system logs, and the explicit email where Julian ordered the dangerous cooling cuts. "Piper, wait, we can handle this internally," Marcus stammered, panic fully overtaking him. "Do not involve the federal regulators." "It is entirely out of my hands now," I said softly. With one decisive tap of my index finger, I hit the submit button. The progress bar flashed green, confirming the complete transfer of the damning evidence directly to the federal investigators. I hung up the phone and placed it face down on the table. I turned my attention back to the live news broadcast streaming on my screen. The camera suddenly zoomed tightly onto the main glass entrance of the facility. The heavy doors slid open, and two burly police officers marched out. Wedged firmly between them was Julian Croft. His hands were bound tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The bespoke, obscenely expensive Italian suit he wore was completely ruined, stained with sweat and wrinkled from the physical struggle. His face was a sickly pale shade of chalk white. Every single ounce of that smug, predatory Wall Street arrogance had been completely ripped away, leaving behind a terrified, broken man who was finally realizing he was going to prison for reckless endangerment of public safety and unauthorized tampering with critical federal infrastructure. Deep beneath the ground he was walking on, my code continued to run flawlessly. The heavy mechanical deadbolts remained locked tight. The liquid nitrogen matrix held the vaults at a perfect, impenetrable freeze, keeping tens of millions of dollars worth of life-saving immunosuppressants completely safe until the official government technicians arrived to secure the inventory. My software was not the villain they claimed it to be. It was the only hero left in that building. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark and shutting off the chaotic world I had left behind. I stood up, left a generous cash tip on the table, and walked out the front door of the diner. The heavy gray clouds above Denver had finally begun to break apart, allowing a brilliant, warm ray of morning sunlight to wash over the freezing asphalt. I took a deep breath of the crisp air and smiled. I had just saved the lives of thousands of incredibly vulnerable patients, and I had successfully burned an unforgivable corporate monster entirely to the ground. Justice had never felt so satisfying. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this story to the very end. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment. Your generous support is the only way we can pay our dedicated team, helping them put food on the table for their families so they can continue creating these amazing revenge stories for you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.